with the Prezi in mind, kind of think back to Lewis's 3 experiences with joy. You know, prior to being 10 years old, he has these experiences, and that's the kind of thing Mrs. Zeffo is talking about there. That you just have that moment, and you're like, okay, this is one of those moments, and you can come back to it and fill that in. I feel like there's one more thing I was going to say before I got up, but it's gone, so it's all right. All right, we are down on point E, room number 2, point E, the Inklings, right? The Inklings. Lewis would say this, right? And I love this quote. He said, "There's no sound I like better than adult male laughter." Right? Think about that for a second. There's no sound I like better than adult male laughter. Lewis and his best friends, all professors, all authors, they would host weekly meetings at a pub that we are all going to visit called the Eagle and the Child, or affectionately known as the Bird and the Baby. These weekly meetings began in 1940, so just prior to, I guess, right in the midst of World War II, just prior to Lewis beginning his publishing career, at least as far as his Christian books go. And ultimately these meetings would last for 16 years, well into 1956. So if you were a fan of children's literature, especially of this time, you should recall that both the Narnia series as well as the Lord of the Rings are both published during this time. So you can see on the outline here, it says Frodo meets Aslan. And when we go to the Eagle and the Child, there's a it's kind of like right next to the bar where you order, but there's a couple of booths that are kind of set aside. Like you get to sit in those. We always try to sit in those booths, but there's a couple of pictures of Lewis and Tolkien, especially. They're the 2 most popular of the Inklings. But that's the spot. Everybody knew Tuesday nights you don't sit in these seats because Jack and Tolkien and Barfield and Dyson, these guys, they were going to come and they were going to smoke and they were going to drink and they were going to eat and they were going to laugh and they were going to share the things they had been writing and reading and thinking about. So you can almost picture, right? You're in that pub, right? I know she's talking about this. The British pub is very different from an American bar, right? Two very different things. But you're in that pub, and it's like, it gives me chills to think about. This is like the birthplace of Frodo, right? Like Bilbo Baggins may have been born. The idea might have been, hey, there's this thing. I'm not really sure what to call it. It's kind of like half a human. They got hairy feet, and so how about a hobbit? Hobbit. That's it. Maybe that's it. Right? And they're talking, and then all of a sudden, like Aslan comes in the page. Like there's this lion. I'm seeing him. I don't know his name yet, but he's just bounding into the scene. And so Aslan and Frodo are almost born in this pub. Moving down to Joy Gresham. I'm going off script here, off notes for just a minute. So it was just around the time, I want to make sure I said everything with the Inklings. I feel like I forgot something. Nope. Okay, we're good. It was right around the time of Mrs. Moore's death, Janie Moore's death, 1951, where Lewis was becoming very popular as a Christian author, a Christian apologist at this time, and he had developed many pen pals. We still have some of these letters, that correspondences he would write. One of his pen pals was an American former teacher. She was an author at the time. Her name was Joy Davidson Gresham. She was married to a man named Bill Gresham. They had, I think, 2 children. I should know that before I get into it. But Gresham and Joy Gresham and Jack, they become pen pals, basically writing back and forth. And so ultimately, Joy wants to go visit. Let me back up a little bit. Joy and her husband, for a long time, they were both atheists and communists, right? They identified themselves as communists in kind of 1930s, early 1940s. And they begin reading C.S. Lewis, especially Mere Christianity, and it was that book which ultimately led both of them to faith in Christ, right? And so that's where they were so fond of C.S. Lewis. So Joy takes her boys, and she wants to go meet Jack. Well, at the same time, C.S. Lewis was having another problem with some other woman claiming to be his wife. There is some random woman who was staying at hotels in the Oxford area, saying she was the wife of C.S. Lewis and running up an enormous hotel tab. And eventually, the hotel calls Lewis and says, your wife has been staying here and run up quite the bill. We need you to pay for it. And he's like, that's strange. I was not aware that I was married. And so ultimately, he had to get an injunction against this woman claiming to be his wife. And she gets arrested, still never denying that she is his wife. She says, well, we must have at least been engaged, right? So you have this very crazy woman stalking Lewis. And then all of a sudden, Joy Gresham shows up while she's still married to Bill. Well, while in England, she is growing very, very fond of Jack, C.S. Lewis, right? Her boys absolutely love him. They have... we don't think a romantic relationship yet, but as far as just an intellectual relationship, she's really starting to fall for him. Really, you know, he loves the candor. He loves the relationship there. Well, while in England, Joy gets a letter from her husband, Bill, right? Bill himself has found something on the side as well, and tells Joy about it and says, maybe you should just stay in England and find yourself something to do there, right? So Joy and Bill Gresham are divorced. So Joy is like, all right, I'm going to go get me a man. So she begins to try to cozy herself up with C.S. Lewis, and he's kind of oblivious to it. He's not quite seeing the romantic nature of this relationship yet, but then a problem comes in. Joy is not permitted. She is not able to stay in England because she can't get a job. They're wanting to send her back. So Jack, out of the goodness of his heart, says, well, let's just get married. She's like, okay, that's what I'm after. So they actually go and they do, make sure you hear this, they go to a civil ceremony. It's not a religious ceremony at all. For Jack, it's not romantic at all. It's basically just his way of helping his friend and her children to stay in the country. So they go through this civil ceremony. She continues to live in her flat while Lewis stays at the Kilns, but then the rumors get started, right, of this woman who's kept her name, but Jack obviously spending a lot of time at the house, and she's like, you need to make me an honest woman. Well, he's like, I don't feel that way. This is not what I want, right? And you know, he's a Christian, and because she's a divorcee, he cannot really have a religious ceremony with her, right? So you got all this going on, and then all of a sudden, another suitor shows up for Joy's attention. You know, Jack's attention is perked. He's like, wait a second. There's another man in the picture, and all of a sudden, he starts to realize his feelings for Joy. At the same time, Joy has been complaining of leg pain. She wasn't really sure what it was. She goes to the doctor, and she's diagnosed with cancer. Right? Cancer which has already affected C.S. Lewis in the loss of his mother. And so not only worried about this other suitor, but now just the threat of losing Joy to this disease that already took his mom, he feels a love for her growing even more. Well, she gets very, very sick. And she is in the hospital. And C.S. Lewis wants to have not just a civil ceremony with her, which they already had, so she could stay, but he wants it to be a real marriage now. He wants to actually marry her in the eyes of God. So he goes and he talks to his priest, right? The priest's like, I can't do it. She's a divorcee. Well, here enters logic, right? Remember, Lewis loved logic, he loved thought, he loved to win the argument. So he says, aha, maybe her marriage to Bill Gresham doesn't count because Bill Gresham had been previously married prior to Joy. And so he basically said that marriage to Joy is invalid in the eyes of God since he was already divorced. Therefore, she's available for the taking, right? Well, the priest said, your logic's not bad. So they have a religious ceremony there in the hospital. She becomes Joy Davidson Gresham Lewis, right? Then a miracle happens. She completely recovers. Her cancer goes into remission, and Jack and Joy, they have like the happiest of years. You can look on the outline here. There's a spoiler on the outline in a second, right? But 1958, the cancer's in remission, right? So it's just a year, but for a year, it was a normal, loving. Lewis would describe it as an eros sort of love relationship with Joy. They traveled. They were giddy. They were like a couple of teenagers in love, and then all of a sudden, I was going to read some. I didn't even bring it. Whoops. All of a sudden, the cancer shows back up, and she dies. Right, and it's in this death where 1959, and Lewis is going to die just a couple years later. It was in this death that Lewis would begin to wrestle with some of the greatest questions of the faith that he had ever wrestled with. He writes a book called A Grief Observed. In fact, we know Lewis wrote this, but he writes it anonymously because it's his final published book. In A Grief Observed, he asks some very serious questions of why does God allow such pain to happen, right? And so if you're going through something, if you wonder, why do bad things happen like this? What does cancer happen? Why does whatever? Go read Lewis's book, A Grief Observed. It's a very honest look from a very thoughtful Christian of how do we deal with this problem of pain. All right, the three C.S. Lewises. I say three. You could probably say 4 or 5 at least, but I want to point out that when we talk about C.S. Lewis, we're really talking about 3 very different people, right? Most people mistake Lewis for either a pastor or a theologian, when in fact that was not his day job. That was not what he got paid to do. Lewis's actual profession was he was professor of medieval literature and history at Oxford University from 1925 to 1954. And then he moves to Cambridge from 1954 to 1963. Now that's a bit like, I don't know how much Mrs. Evos talked about the Oxford-Cambridge rivalry, right? But we live in the college football South, so think of whatever your team is and that team's biggest rival, right? At least on the football field. That's how big it is between Oxford and Cambridge. Actually, probably bigger because these schools go back to the 1200s, right? So this is a significant move. Basically, Oxford was not offering Lewis a full professorship. And so it's like, you know what? Cambridge came calling, so I'm going to do it. So he would ride the train from Oxford to Cambridge every week. He would stay in Cambridge and then return home. Here's how Lewis was described as a professor. No one knew better how to nourish a pupil with encouragement and how to press just criticism when it was needed without causing resentment. He did not think of himself as taking pupils through a course. Rather, Lewis saw himself as getting to spend 2 or 3 years with a student for them to be under his guidance, during which they could start a process which would occupy the rest of their lives of asking and answering questions. And as a professor, Lewis had 3 standard responses, right? I think I've graded everybody's essay in here at some point. So I use a couple words. You're like, what does this say, Zeph? I said, well, probably says lacks development or lacks detail. Everybody remember that? Or you've just recently seen that probably, right? Lewis had a couple of his own very familiar responses. If the work turned into him was good, he would say, there is a good deal in what you have to say. It was just okay work, average work. He would say there is something in what you say. If it was poor work, he would say there might be something in what you have to say, but it's not there yet, right? Or he would use the euphemism, he would say, too much straw, not enough brick. Or as we might say, right, too many bones, not enough meat. Well, the second C.S. Lewis is the Christian apologist, the defender of the Christian faith. Ultimately, this is how most people come to know C.S. Lewis. It's either through the children's stories or through Mere Christianity or The Problem of Pain. And so Lewis was never a pastor, but he saw himself as an evangelist, as someone who preached and interpreted the good news of Jesus. In fact, he got to meet Billy Graham, who recently passed away, in the 1950s. And they had a phenomenal conversation. In fact, Lewis says, look, you have kind of a bad reputation over here. He tells Graham that. He's like, people don't like you, but I don't see any of the things that they're saying about you, right? So Lewis and Graham did have that one interaction. Well, his first theological work, it's actually part of a trilogy, was called The Problem of Pain. This was first published in 1940, so you should recognize, again, right before England is heavily involved in World War II. And here's how he begins that book. First words in the book are this. Not many years ago, when I was an atheist, right? So it really catches the reader off guard that, here's somebody who used to be an atheist and now is very intelligently, very methodically defending the Christian faith, right? And in this book, he would argue for the existence of God through the midst of suffering and turmoil. Now, if you've tuned out, get this. You've got to think of the climate, right? The spiritual climate of Lewis's day. There's four men here that I'm going to call the prophets of the Enlightenment. I'm sure you guys have studied Enlightenment at some point, right? Obviously Charles Darwin, right? Who is the prophet of prophet of science. And Karl Marx as the prophet of government and economics. Friedrich Nietzsche, the prophet of philosophy, and Sigmund Freud, the prophet of psychology, all atheists, all calling the reliability of Scripture into question, along with a seeming lack of necessity for God. So these four thinkers, Darwin, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, right, all atheists, really began to whittle away at the authority of Scripture and the need for God. In fact, Christian belief was highly discredited among intellectuals during this time. For example, author Virginia Woolf, she commented on T.S. Eliot's conversion, said this: I've had a most shameful and distressing interview with dear Tom Eliot, who may be called dead to us from this day forward. He has become an Anglo-Catholic believer in God and immortality, and he goes to church. And it was for that reason that Virginia Woolf can say he is now dead to us. He's one of those guys, right? But ultimately, Lewis was in a pursuit of truth. He was not in pursuit of popular opinion. Here's what he says. In fact, no, that's not okay. Christianity is a statement which, if false, you've probably heard this, which, if false, is of no importance, and if true, is of infinite importance. The only thing Christianity cannot be is moderately important. So Lewis saw his role as, and I think this is the final question there, Lewis saw his role as a translator of the Christian faith, of basically interpreting Christian doctrine and making it accessible for people to understand. That's why when I finally read Mere Christianity, way too late, probably 2010, when I finally read this book, I was like, I get it now. I get why every other Christian thinker quotes from and uses C.S. Lewis's arguments. And probably the most famous of his arguments, as most of you in this room, I think my B-Day students have yet to get through this yet, is C.S. Lewis's trilemma. Any B-Day in here? Have we talked about the trilemma?
Nope.
I don't think we have. Okay.
Nope.
I think everybody else has heard the trilemma. So the rest of you should remember this a bit. Lewis says, either a person can accept that Jesus is who he says he is, or concede to saying that he was a megalomaniac. No middle ground exists. No soft argument claiming him just a great moral teacher. Here it is. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him and call him a demon and kill him as a demon. Or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. And that's the famous liar, lunatic, Lord argument from C.S. Lewis. Hopefully you guys remember that. Your first interaction with C.S. Lewis was probably as children's author. Somebody not seen a Narnia movie in here? Never seen Narnia? Wow. All right. So for your movie choice, please go watch Narnia. Watch them all. They're actually really good movies. But Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Just a beautiful picture, not only of, it was only not well done of this book, but a beautiful picture of the fall, redemption, Christ's sacrifice through Aslan's death and resurrection, forgiveness. There are a couple guys, Isaac thinks I'm not doing it, but no, I'm not doing it.
Do it.
Everyone's seen the tattoo. We'll see that tattoo.
Do it.
Rip the shirt off.
Do it.
Do it.
Yeah. We're gonna flex Aslan orders, right?
Do it.
All right.
Do it.
So C.S. Lewis was 52 in 1950 when The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was first released. Now, this came as a shock to many of his fellow professors, right? And then one volume of the Narnia series would be added annually for the next 6 years. So some of you may have something like this in your house where it's all 7. This one has the White Witch. Many of them have Aslan, that picture of Aslan on the side. This is all 7 novels. Now, if you notice, this is not, this starts with The Magician's Nephew, then goes to Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. That's not how they were written. Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe was written first. Magician's Nephew did not come till much, much later. So this is the chronological order of the books, right, as far as the books go. This is not the publishing order. So just, if you read these, you should read these. You should just know that, right, that Lewis wrote them in a different order than you are reading them. Now, they're a surprise because the apologetics books for which he had become so widely known were very, they were already known and well published, right? He's still a beloved Oxford Don, right? He's still teaching at Oxford University, this very high intellectual thing. And all of a sudden, we have Professor Lewis writing children's novels, right? Yet still today, hundreds of children every year who do not know that C.S. Lewis is dead write him letters and thanking him for the Narnian stories. And nearly all ask, what inspired you to write them? And here's what Lewis said. All my 7 Narnia books began as pictures in my head. I love it. This gives me chills, by the way. At first, I had very little idea how the story would go. But then suddenly, Aslan came bounding into the picture. And once he was there, he pulled the whole story together. Now, Lewis also credits inspiration for writing these novels